it's Ellie Masters, and I hope you're enjoying this free audio exclusive of Rescuing Melissa, a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance, all rolled into one.
JEM Publishing presents the unabridged recording of Rescuing Melissa, The Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1, written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.
56. Unexpected Guests. Pierce. I opened the cupboards in my kitchen and then slammed them shut, harder than necessary, not finding what I was looking for. Letting my irritation show with Scott was a bad idea, but I was mad, and maybe a little excited, too. I know, it doesn't make sense to me either. It was incredible down there. We were side by side, swinging our whips and soaking in delicious screams. I'd never had an experience like that. Not with him. Not with anyone ever again. Fear, sweat, the most delicious aroma in the world still tickled my nose. And thank God I hadn't passed out with that orgasm. It had been risky, but Belle knew how best to handle me. She protected me as much or more than I protected her. Allowing him inside my most treasured space still had my skin crawling. Within one breath and the next, I both hated and admired him. But he had the heart of a killer, and was more than capable of bringing everything I'd worked to build crashing down around me. My princesses depended on me for their lives. He needed to leave. "I'm hungry," I called out. "I'm fixing a sandwich. Do you want something?" Scott walked around my kitchen island, dragging his hand over the marble surface. His dark eyes held mine with a wildness I couldn't match. At that moment, he measured and weighed me, leaving me to wonder what he found. Was I still his pupil, or had I become his equal? We were both sizing each other up, assessing strengths, weaknesses, liabilities, and threats. "Yeah, sounds good. Do you mind if I use your bathroom?" The man had used my princess for a blowjob, caned my queen, and was bothering to ask permission to use my restroom. You see how crazy he is, right? "Second door on the left," I pointed down the hall. I busied myself, pulling out supplies to make sandwiches. Where was the mayonnaise? It was close to dinner time, and I would have rather pulled out steak and grilled it the way I liked, but splitting a steak with Scott felt too much like sharing a meal. I didn't want him to get too comfortable. Holding the door to the fridge open with my shoulder, I poked my head inside and dug for condiments, thinking about getting rid of him. The problem of him not having a car hadn't escaped me. His escape plan seemed poorly thought out, and not at all what I expected from the man who taught me to plan for every contingency. The doorbell rang. Just what I didn't need. I continued my search for the mayonnaise and ignored the front door. No one came to my house unless they were selling things. Whoever it was could move on to the next home and sell whatever it was to my neighbor. Not to mention, there was no way in hell I was answering the door with the fairytale serial killer, a guest in my home. I wasn't an idiot. There it was, hiding behind the milk. I shut the door to the fridge with mayo in hand and heard the squeal of the front door hinges as it opened. "Well, hello, have I died and gone to heaven?" What the hell was that idiot thinking? Hastily, I put everything down and edged my way to where I could see the front room. Bubbly female laughter floated through the house.
We are organizing a charity event for our sorority, and we're hoping to get the neighborhood involved by sponsoring our event. We're taking donations of used clothing and other items.
Scott's low, appreciative growl told me that conversation headed in a dangerous direction. I didn't know how to stop him, but I hurried to the living room, determined to get that girl to the house next door. Unfortunately, he already invited her inside. My front door creaked closed, sealing her inside with him, a lethal predator, and me, a man now responsible for protecting her. "Ah, Pierce," he said. "Look what landed on our doorstep." "My doorstep, you bastard, not ours." "Good evening." I gave the girl my best smile. Scott maneuvered her to the love seat, gesturing for her to take a seat. He gave the blonde a suggestive wink. Dear Lord, her breasts were huge. She soaked up Scott's attention, even wiggling her tits. A slow smile of anticipation stretched across Scott's face.
"My name's Charlie,"
she said. "Nice to meet you," I replied. Charlie's boobs bounced as she sat in the overstuffed love seat. "My name's Scott." My unwanted houseguest sat opposite her in my favorite wing-backed chair. I took the empty one beside him. "You said you were looking for sponsors for an event?"
"The Run Walk is a charitable event for the local women's shelter, and we're looking for donations of clothing, women's and children's sizes, and soaps and shampoos. The best are those little hotel-sized bottles you get when you travel. We pack those up into gift packs for the women. You'd be amazed at how much these women have lost."
She launched into her speech about battered women, her sorority's charity work, and the plans for the 5K walk-run. Scott listened with avid attention. It focused on Charlie's tits, a fact Charlie seemed to capitalize on. Maybe she thought it would get her a more substantial donation. Little did she know, her breasts would lead to her death. Scott's eyes widened with each bounce and jiggle, and I knew what request he would soon make of me. I don't enjoy killing, and only did so when necessary. Take, for example, the nurse downstairs. Killing him was unavoidable, and nothing I would take pleasure in. Scott, however, took perverse pleasure in death. Am I a bad person because there's a bit of me that hungered to see what that would be like? To stand beside him and watch him work? It's not that I wanted to see the blonde die, but could I pass on this opportunity? Would it be a proper send-off to give him this one gift? It would keep him away from my princesses, that was certain. "Well, I'm all for supporting a cause," Scott said with a laugh. "Anything I can do to help those in need is a worthwhile endeavor." Charlie leaned toward him, pressing her ample breasts together to enhance her already astounding cleavage. She batted her lashes, and I coughed at how blatant she was acting. Didn't she know how foolish that was?
"Oh, that's wonderful. We could use all the donations we can get."
He moved to sit beside her, and to my surprise, she didn't back away. In fact, his move seemed to encourage her. She put a hand on Scott's thigh, a bit too high, and it was clear her fingers were suggesting what sort of thank you would be delivered. "Well, how nice." Scott's breath hitched. "Are you expected anywhere soon?" Scott nuzzled her ear with his nose.
"No."
Scott gave a low chuckle. "Darling, do you have any idea what you're getting yourself into?" The girl pouted and drew back.
"I think I have a good idea of what comes next."
Her eyes shifted to the hall and to the bedrooms beyond. Scott smiled. His straight white teeth glinted in the overhead light. His gaze caught mine, asking permission. I nodded. Despite the risks, I desperately wanted to see him at work. "Charlie, my friend and I are a little unconventional," he said. "How adventurous are you feeling?" Her eyes widened.
"I like unconventional."
"We have a playroom in the basement. Much more fun than the bedroom." Charlie clapped her hands.
"Oh, you're kinky."
I loved college co-eds. They were curious and open to new experiences. Just then, Scott's stomach growled. It was loud, unexpected, and broke the mood. It also reminded me of my hunger and the reason we'd come upstairs. Scott's booming laugh filled the room. "How about we grab a bite to eat? Pierce and I were just about to make sandwiches when you knocked on our door. Are you hungry?" Charlie bit her lower lip, looking uncertain. "Come," he said, leading her toward the kitchen. "I'll have much more fun if I'm not thinking about my stomach. We have all night to play." She gave him a slight smile.
Do you mind if I use your restroom?
I gestured toward the hallway. Second door on the left,
Thank you.
she said in a soft tone. Scott and I moved to the kitchen, where I pulled out a third plate. I want her, he said in a lowered voice. I know. He returned a surprised look. She's yours. Warmth surged in my chest to give him this gift. And I can do whatever you want. I finished his sentence, giving him the affirmative he wanted to hear. And your rule about blood? I wrinkled my nose, thinking about the mess. Just keep it contained. Scott crossed his arms over his chest. How are we going to get her down there? You already told her the playroom was downstairs. We'll take her down. I keep my supplies down there. You finish up here while I go prep. I headed to the back of my basement, past the long ordered rows of emergency supplies, and stopped short of my wine collection. Opening a nondescript box, I pulled out a bottle of clear fluid and grabbed a couple of dish rags. I saturated 2 cloths and placed them within easy reach beside the wine rack. The rags should stay moist enough until we brought the girl downstairs. I grabbed a bottle of Merlot as a smile filled my face. Beer was good for a casual drink. Tonight deserved something special. There were so many ways I could work this. My queen waited for my attention. I wanted to take her tonight, but felt awkward doing so in front of Scott. Did I claim my queen? Or did I fuck one of the others? I hated tough decisions. Belle would be fun. I could use her to show what I expected from my queen. When I came upstairs, the lilting laughter of the girl echoed through my home. Interspersed through her energetic chatter, Scott's more guttural tones grated on my ears. He had Charlie on the kitchen counter, feeding her a sandwich. Charlie giggled as he teased her with the food, pulling it away from her lips at the last second. A kiss for a bite, my pretty. Didn't anyone teach this ravaging beauty to be wary of strangers? Her eyes kept darting down to the basement like she couldn't wait to get down there. If she only knew, she would never leave. I took my time with my food. There was no reason to rush. Besides, Scott was feeding Charlie her last meal. I walked my plate over to the sink. Last chance to back out, I called over my shoulder. Charlie shrugged.
Oh, I'm good.
I turned on the water. Go freshen up. Scott and I will clean the dishes. I waved her toward the living room, making it in order by the tone of my voice. I pointed to the dirty plates, indicating he should bring them over. She disappeared back into the living room and down the hall. You've got to be fucking kidding me. Scott slammed the plates on the counter. We're stopping to do the dishes? Don't be an idiot. His eyes widened, and he took half a step back. His fingers clenched into fists, and his arms flexed. Seriously. I grabbed his shirt and pulled him close before his temper ran too far afield. Was he that stupid? Do you want to know the plan or go in blind? My words mollified him. His shoulders relaxed and his jaw unclenched. His head dipped. I whispered, I soaked rags in chloroform. They're sitting on the shelves just before the wine cellar. We take her down, subdue her there, then carry her to the dungeon. We'll tie her up once we're inside. He rubbed his hands together with anticipation. He was a sick fuck. But then I wondered, who was more messed up? The man who would torture, rape, and kill a young girl? Or the one who would watch? What do you think? 57. Curtains. CJ. There. Movement in a window of the house caught CJ's eye. He waved to Mac to get his attention. Mac squinted and stared at the suburban house. She's unlocking the windows. A minute later, a curtain flapped in the second bedroom. The third bedroom faced opposite the street, so they couldn't tell if she'd unlocked that one as well. Probably not. It would be too risky. She better not get caught, CJ said with concern. His skin itched to rush inside the house, take down the men, and save Melissa. Instead, he and Mac jogged up and crouched below the window. "She knows what she's doing," Mac said. "Those assholes are cleaning up the lunch dishes before taking her downstairs. I'm sure she's in the clear. She'd better leave soon." Part of him wanted Charlie to go with the men downstairs. That order had been one of her instructions, and he needed to know if Melissa was in the house. It was a dangerous gamble, and he prayed he didn't regret it later. He'd never risk Charlie's safety with such a bold move, but he trusted her ability to take care of herself. If he'd been able to send Jenny inside as well, he'd feel a lot better. He reminded himself Charlie was alone. No matter how well trained, she was outnumbered, which meant they had to be ready to act. He rapped on the glass, making sure he was concealed behind the bushes. Damn things were filled with thorns. Using Morse code, he sent her a message. "If unsafe, outside, now." With a tap on the glass, she replied, "GTG," which meant she was good to go. He blew out his breath. The final decision would be hers to make. He hated being so far removed from the action. Helpless. That's how he felt. Mac's jaw was set. He'd sunk into attack mode. CJ felt the mood hit him too. That moment before a mission when the world narrowed into crystalline focus and life balanced on a knife's edge. There was a loud knock on the inner door. Charlie's squeak was followed by a deep masculine voice. "You going to stay in there all day? Or do you want to play? Pierce and I are getting impatient."
I'll be right out.
Damn, he hoped she could extricate herself without raising suspicion. She tapped on the glass. 5. Then come. Anything could happen in the next 5 minutes. 58. Lights out. Pierce. I waited in the kitchen while Scott fetched the girl. Her lilting laughter sounded from the front room, letting me know it was time. Our guest walked into the kitchen. Scott had his arm around the blonde. He gave me a grin and arched a brow. "Come." I stepped forward and extended a hand. She did a little hop step, the excited bounce broadcasting her eagerness to die. Her delicate fingers warmed my palm. Soon they would be slick with fear, then cold as death. "Let's head downstairs." I smiled, trying to do my best to make her feel comfortable, but my comment didn't return the eagerness I'd expected. She said.
I don't know about this. I think maybe I should go."
"Oh?" I tried to hide the disappointment in my voice. "Stay and play a while." Her eyes shifted toward the living room and to the front door. I couldn't afford to lose her, not when we were so close. Her sacrifice would protect my princesses.
I really think I should go.
"No. We won't keep you, but you came for donations. I have boxes of supplies downstairs. You can have whatever you see." She hesitated, but then seemed to remember why she'd stopped at my door. Her need to make her charitable donation quota would be her end. Sorority girls were so dumb. I led her down the steps, and Scott followed. Keeping her close, I hoped Scott was smart enough to work with me. Timing was vital. I had to get the chloroform and smother her until I was sure she was out. Charlie glanced at the rows of supplies.
Wow, you have tons down here. Are you one of those disaster prep guys?
"Kind of. Come, the women's clothes are in the back." I draped my arm over her shoulder, tugging her close.
Cool,
she said. Her breathy voice annoyed me. "Pierce was an Eagle Scout, Charlie," Scott chimed in. "He's always prepared." I forgot I'd shared that with him. The guy was supposed to be dead, not wandering around my basement, messing up my life. We finally made it to the wine cellar.
Oh my,
she said.
What a collection.
Yes, and behind the wine a door led down a tunnel to my dungeon. For Charlie, it would be the last trip she ever made. I grabbed the rag saturated in chloroform. She gave a look, then her eyes widened when I pressed the cloth to her nose and mouth, pinning her arms to her sides. She kicked at me, but she was no match for my strength. Oddly, she never screamed, but I was confident she breathed the foul substance because her body went limp. Too much chloroform could be disastrous, so I removed the rag. She sagged like a sack of potatoes. A quick check of her pulse revealed her resting comfortably. How is she? Scott's grin stretched tight across his face. He tried to lift her limp body into a fireman's carry, grunted with the effort, then looked for help. Flabby bastard. I helped him hoist her over his shoulder. How long before she comes around? I shrugged. We have a few minutes. Don't worry. The wine racks moved to the side, and I opened the locks. I had done this so many times I could do it in my sleep. Scott pressed himself beside me, too eager to get into the tunnel. I swallowed a curse as he bumped me, but I didn't have time to deal with his rudeness. Charlie's arms hung limply down his back, hitting my butt as I turned to re-secure the door. He was already at the far end of the tunnel, shifting back and forth with poorly concealed impatience for me to join him. I took my time because it would piss him off, and I had to check the locks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hurry! He waved me forward. I didn't. He pointed to the locks on the final door. Open them. He rubbed a hand over his face. There was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. Hurry! I leveled to stare at him. Relax. We have plenty of time before she comes to. I lifted her arm and released it. Her arm flopped. No muscle tone. Well, maybe a hint. She would be waking soon. His eyes were wide and black. There was a fierceness in his expression, a hint of crazy that gave me a moment's pause, but I continued with the locks. We had an agreement. Tonight, only. Then he would leave. If he didn't, I had no problems killing him along with Dickwad inside. His bloodlust was too dangerous, and I had responsibilities. Finally, I pulled the last lock free and cranked on the door mechanism, pushing the door inward. Scott shouldered past me, Charlie's limp body bouncing against his back. A new wave of irritation washed over me. A loud thwack sounded. Fuck! Scott screamed. Thwack. Whoosh. Snap. A body thumped to the floor. You fucking bitch! Thwack. 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 I rushed inside. A bolt of pain connected with my shoulder. What the... The sting of a whip wrapped around my waist, taking my breath away as fire lit up my world. Thwack. Thwack. Swish. Something solid connected with my ribs. Whoosh. Snap. A fucking cane. Pain became my universe. My ribs cracked under the pressure of the strike. A whip caught my cheek. Something smacked into my back, catapulting me forward onto the ground. I covered my face with my hands just in time to see my fairy godmother raise her arm and flick the whip.
59. Escape. Melissa. The cane twisted in Melissa's grip. Her hands were cramped from holding it tight. The sound of metal rasping on the other side of the door had her stomach tangling in knots. Pierce was undoing the locks. A look of pure terror filled Henrietta's face. Melissa swallowed her fear. At least one of them needed to be strong. It was now or never. Dear God, she could die. Charles lumbered over. Something wasn't right with the way he moved his legs. She waved him away, but he gave a determined glare like there was no way in hell she was keeping him from helping out. Not that she could fault him. Live or die, they would do it together. Charles positioned himself behind the door and took the paddle Henrietta offered. His expression was nearly as fierce as the mother of two. Melissa's blood chilled. Belle had been silenced. After Henrietta's concerns, they cuffed and gagged Pierce's first princess. Some sort of crazy lived in Belle's eyes. The others sat in their cages. Fearful whimpers accompanied their tearful sobs, but they hadn't shouted a warning. Melissa and Henrietta had debated freeing them, but Henrietta didn't trust the brainwashing the girls had undergone. Not to mention they didn't have the combinations to the locks. "Now or never," Henrietta said. "They will kill us for this." Melissa couldn't speak. She knew the evil beyond that door. The killing would only come after great pain. When the locks released, she and Henrietta jumped. The door opened inward. Scott stepped through. The cane in Melissa's hand came up and then smacked down. Again and again she struck, mindless, not with fury but with suffocating fear. Whack, whack, whack. Scott dropped something from his shoulders. It landed with a solid thump. A body? Had they brought another woman down? There was no time to think. The whip cracked. Her cane struck. Scott cursed. Melissa wielded the cane in one hand and the whip in the other, becoming something wild and altogether not sane. Her ex-husband fell to his knees, giving her a much better target to aim at. She took advantage of his position and landed another volley of strikes. Charles kicked Scott. His bare foot smacked Scott's stomach with a squelching sound. Charles brought down the paddle. The thick chunk of wood cracked her ex-husband on the head. She took a step back, horrified. Hell, she was part of this madness. A second figure shouldered through the doorway. Henrietta fell upon Pierce with a ferocity Melissa had never seen before. The twisted expression on Henrietta's face didn't even look human. And then, to confuse things even more, a blonde flurry of fists, arms, legs, and feet rose from the ground, spinning and kicking in a blur of motion. Melissa couldn't keep track of anything. The blonde concentrated her energy on Pierce, aiding Henrietta's efforts. Somehow, the girl kept out of range of Henrietta's cane. Melissa staggered back, her hand moving from her mouth to her chest, as if that would silence her heart's raging beat. Charles beat Scott over the head with the paddle and kicked him in the ribs with legs and feet that didn't work quite right. Scott covered his face as he curled into a fetal ball. Charles's assault was relentless. Henrietta screamed at the top of her lungs. The blonde fury of fists and feet landed blow upon blow on Pierce until he, too, was reduced to a pile of quivering flesh on the floor. Melissa couldn't make out the words for all the screaming. Wait, she was screaming, not Henrietta. The blonde grunted as Pierce gripped her ankle and yanked her to the ground. "Get a pair of goddamn handcuffs!" the woman yelled. Melissa paused. This had CJ written all over it. He had to be close. My hero. The woman kicked Pierce in the chin, both of them grappling on the ground. Henrietta stood over them, looking unsure of what to do, perhaps worried one of her strikes might hurt the unexpected help. "Get cuffs!" the woman barked again. She put Pierce in a headlock, and his face reddened. Melissa looked to the wall and scanned for cuffs. Henrietta shouted, "The bed! Get him to the bed!" Pierce's face turned an unhealthy shade of purple. The girl did some judo flip move, which had her on her feet and Pierce's neck locked in a ninja elbow hold. With Henrietta's help, she dragged Pierce to the four-poster bed. His mouth opened and closed, gulping for air. Melissa reached for the collar and closed it around his neck with a satisfying clunk. Pierce stared back, purple-faced, his eyes bulging with murderous intent. Henrietta moved to the head of the bed and pulled out a set of metal wrist cuffs attached to long chains. She snapped these around Pierce's wrists before Melissa could blink. Seconds later, a set of ankle cuffs followed. Melissa glanced toward the open door. Shadows raced toward them, growing larger as booted feet echoed down the tunnel. She turned to stand in victory over her tormentor, but the look on the blonde's face made her pause. A hand gripped Melissa's hair and yanked her head back. Scott growled.
"You fucking bitch."
Something cold and sharp pressed against her throat. Scott pulled her against his chest, spinning her toward the door. Pierce had been trussed up like an animal. The blonde stood behind him, holding the chains. Henrietta teetered by her side. Charles was on the ground, blood trickling from his temple, knocked out cold. And there, barreling through the doorway, CJ came to an abrupt stop.
"Come any closer and I kill her."
Scott pressed the knife to her throat.
60. Escape. Take 2. CJ. A flash of silver was the first thing CJ saw, followed by the whites of Melissa's terrified eyes. His mad dash ended between one step and the next, bringing him to a stuttering stop with his weapon aimed between Scott Patterson's eyes. Take the shot. Years of training kicked in. There was no way to assure Melissa's safety, not with the press of a knife against her throat. Mac was 2 steps behind him. He gripped CJ's shoulder, but there was no need. It wasn't a clean shot. Jenny sidestepped Mac and swept the room with her gun drawn. A man lay on the ground, horribly disfigured by whip and cane marks. He labored to breathe, and blood trickled from a gash in his head. What the fuck was the nurse from the hospital doing here? No way to know if he was a victim or a threat, but for now he wasn't conscious. There were too many fucking people to cover. Trussed up between the uprights of a 4-poster bed, Pierce fucking Channing yanked on the chains which bound him. The foulest expression of murder scrawled on his face. Charlie stood behind him, chains taut in her hands, and beside Charlie, Henrietta Jones trembled, her face a ghostly white. Terror shone in her eyes, and her hand covered her mouth, perhaps to stifle a scream. His quick scan took less than a second. 2 rows of cages, 4 to each side. All but 2 occupied. The farthest cage held a woman cuffed to the metal bars with a red ball gag in her mouth. "Release him," Scott Patterson demanded. "Or I swear to God I'll kill her." CJ held his gun steady. Scott jerked Melissa back, and the knife bit into the skin of her throat. A bead of red formed on her ivory skin and trickled down her neck. Melissa tensed. Charlie stared at CJ, seeking his lead. Jenny edged into the room, her movements slow, deliberate, and meant to flank. "There is nowhere to go," CJ said. "It's over." Scott laughed. "As if." He jerked his chin toward Pierce. "I trained him well. I'm betting my life on another way out." There was a look exchanged between the men, confirming CJ's fears. "Your guns don't scare me," Scott said. "But I sure as hell bet my knife terrifies you. Release him or I kill her." Scott jerked the knife against Melissa's throat. So close. So fucking close. He wouldn't lose her like this. Henrietta backed away from the bed until she came up against the bars of one of the nearest cages. He was glad to have her out of the way, which would make whatever came next easier. He tapped Mac's hand, which dug into his shoulder. "Check on him." Mac bent down, placing a finger to the man's throat. "He's alive." Brett and John were in the tunnel behind them, but kept themselves out of sight. He could only imagine the fire burning in their bellies, knowing Charlie was inside. But they were well trained and knew the mission came first. Pierce's sharp command echoed in the dungeon. "Release me!" CJ could kill Scott, but not before the lunatic put his knife to its intended use. There wasn't a clear shot that wouldn't place Melissa at unacceptable risk. With his gut churning, CJ put his faith in his team. "Release him," Scott growled. Charlie removed the cuffs. Pierce ran his fingers around the metal band encircling his neck, pulled a key out of his pocket, and popped the lock. The next few moments brought a bead of sweat to CJ's brow. He was playing a dangerous game of chess. Scott pulled Melissa toward the back wall. A look of resignation filled her face, and something else. Undeniable trust. He hoped he was worthy of that trust. Pierce left Charlie at the bed and stormed over to the cage holding the woman with the ball gag in her mouth. She gazed at him, adoration filling her face. He petted the top of her head and worked the combination lock to the cell. "Belle, will you serve me?" Pierce released the gag, easing it out from behind her teeth.
"Master,"
she said with a bow of her head.
"How may I serve?"
"You must go upstairs." Her head snapped up. A look of terror scrawled on her face. "I know, Belle. You must leave your home, but only until we find another." Her body trembled, but she agreed to his demand with a nod. Pierce undid the cuffs binding her wrists. "We don't have fucking time for this," Scott hissed. "I won't leave Belle. Besides," Pierce said with a snort, "how the fuck do you think we're going to get away on foot?" CJ glanced between the two men, feeling the tension spike between them. Pierce made soothing sounds to the woman as he gave instructions. "Go upstairs. Get the keys to the van. Bring it around. You know where?" Belle nodded. CJ put a hand behind him and signaled Mac, knowing he would telegraph the message back to Brett and John, who hid in the tunnel. Mac took a step back to relay the code. "Upstairs. Girl. Van. Be inside." He didn't hear Brett and John retreat, but he would have killed them if he had. Belle fell to her knees.
"Master,"
she said in a breathy whisper.
"I'm so scared."
Her eyes flicked towards CJ, Mac, and Jenny. They blocked her exit from the dungeon, with cold steel gripped in their hands. "Be brave, my slave," Pierce said. He kissed the top of her head and then removed his shirt. "Put this on. Can't have you driving naked. The keys are on the kitchen counter. You remember where to go?" She nodded. "Good." Pierce's eyes darkened when the sweep of his gaze landed on Jenny. He stepped back, wary of the 3 guns trained on his chest. "No way in hell is that happening," Max said with a rumble. "The 2 of you will let Belle pass." Pierce spoke as if they would do as he commanded. Mac leaned forward, his bulk intimidating Pierce into taking an involuntary step back. "Put those down," Pierce demanded, "and kick them this way." He jerked his chin at Jenny. "You too, princess." CJ's mind worked the puzzle pieces in his head, moving his resources on the virtual board of chess. If there was another way out of this hellhole, like Scott suggested, he needed to buy time for Brett and John. It was a risk, but one he was willing to take. They were at a standoff with Melissa's life hanging by a thread. Losing the weapons was a gamble, but he believed in his team. He lowered his weapon and placed it on the ground. "CJ," Mac growled. "Trust me." He twisted the radio frequency ID ring on his finger. Their guns could only be activated in proximity to the rings worn on their trigger fingers. He kicked his weapon toward the middle of the room and prayed Pierce didn't attempt to take a shot. Glancing at the women in the cages, he made an assumption about the tension clogging the air between Pierce and Scott. One was a killer. The other was not. He gambled the lives of everyone on a hunch Pierce wouldn't kill. Mac breathed out, then followed CJ's lead. His gun went skittering across the ground to join CJ's. "Now yours," Pierce said to Jenny. "Kick your weapon over." CJ didn't like having his entire team disarmed, but with Brett and John outside, the edge of surprise remained theirs. And Sam should arrive soon with even more reinforcements. A triumphant grin filled Pierce's face when Jenny slid her weapon over to join the others. Pierce directed Belle to gather the guns. The woman scurried to the middle of the room and scooped up their pistols. CJ's chest squeezed, then released when Belle handed his and Mac's weapons to Pierce and gave Jenny's to Patterson. Pierce shoved Mac's weapon under his waistband and gripped CJ's gun. If Pierce tried to fire the weapon, he would discover the RFID lock. Pierce's smile flashed greasy white. "Belle, you have always served me well,"
"Thank you, Master,"
she said in a whisper. "But you're not done yet." She shuddered and glanced at the doorway leading out of the room. "Lock the door on your way out." Lock the door. Melissa was too far away. While he and Mac could subdue Pierce, Jenny wouldn't have enough time to close in on and disarm Scott. Melissa would die. Pierce waved Belle toward the door. She scurried to obey, keeping as wide a berth from CJ and Mac as she could. She stepped over the unconscious man, then pulled the door shut. Metal rasped on metal, the sound of locks engaging. CJ took in a deep breath. His team was unarmed and locked in. Time for the final move to play out. But he hadn't made it this far in his career by being a fool. Pierce didn't know it, but he'd made a juvenile mistake. So far, everything was coming together, even if it didn't look like it. Pierce might discover the RFID locks on the triggers. If that happened, someone would die. But CJ had a feeling Pierce didn't enjoy killing. Scott was the wild card. "You're going to rot down here," Pierce said with a snort. "And what of them?" CJ waved to the rows of cages. Pierce flinched. "Casualties I must accept." He breathed in and forced the breath out, looking resolute. He cocked his head. CJ expected a reaction from the women, but only a soul-wrenching nothingness returned from the cages. Pierce condemned these women to death, and not a single one reacted. What had he done to steal the life from them? Pierce moved to a spot behind Belle's cage. He pried a panel off the wall, revealing a mechanism inside, and pulled on a lever. The wall behind Belle's cage slid to the side, revealing another tunnel. Pierce gave instructions to Scott. "Go. I'm right behind you." Scott forced Melissa into the tunnel, and Pierce followed. A few seconds later, the concrete slab slid back into place, leaving CJ, Mac, and Jenny trapped inside. "I hope you know what you're doing," Mac growled. Mac turned to the woman standing behind Charlie. "Where does he keep the keys?" She rubbed her hands together and brought them to her mouth as if saying a prayer.
He carries them on him, and the cages are combination locks.
Mac went to the box on the far wall. "Fucking lever won't budge." He went to one of the cages and looked at the woman inside. "What's your name?" The poor thing shook and buried her head in her hands. "Shh," Mac cooed. "I promise we're going to get you out. This nightmare is over."
Beauty. My name is Beauty.
Mac cocked his head. "No, sweetie. That isn't your name. It never was. Now tell me who you are."
Is he gone?
She flinched when Mac rested his hand on one of the bars of her cage. "He's gone."
My name is Sarah. Sarah Mackenzie.
CJ called out. "Well, Sarah, you're getting out of here. Mac, get over here. Jenny and Charlie, find a way to break those locks." A groan sounded from the floor. The unconscious man was coming around. He lifted himself to his elbow, and with great effort struggled to a sitting position. "What happened?" he asked. "Do you think you can stand?" Mac reached down to help the man to his feet. "Not just yet. I'm getting there, though." He shook his head, waving off Mac's help. "Why do you look familiar?" Mac asked. "We met at the hospital when Miss Evans was discharged." Pierce had been there, too. The delivery man with the rose. If he and Mac had arrived a few minutes later, Melissa might have disappeared from the world for good. "How did you get here?" CJ asked. Charles huffed a laugh. "Because I was stupid and didn't mind my drink. At least I think that's how he got me. Nothing else makes sense. I went to a bar, talked to him, and things got fuzzy from there. Next I know, I'm strapped against that wall, and he demands that I take care of Gretel." He pointed to the one woman who had yet to move. CJ turned to Henrietta. "Henrietta Jones?" Her eyes widened with shock. "Name is CJ. This is Mac. Charlie and Jenny are also on my team. I know 2 little girls who will be very happy to have their mother back. We've been looking for you."
Are my girls okay?
"They are." Henrietta lifted her gaze to the ceiling, mouthing another prayer.
I wanted to believe. Melissa told me not to lose hope.
A look of hopefulness crossed her face.
Oh, dear God. What are they going to do to her?
"Don't worry, Melissa will be fine." He turned his attention to getting out and joining the rest of his team. "Help me with the door," he said to Mac. "How? It's locked from the other side." He ran his hands around the edges and landed on the hinges. "This door might be locked, but it swings inward. It's a rookie mistake." "So?" Mac's gaze traced the lines of the door. CJ tapped the hinge holding the door in place. We pull the pins and the door comes off. Now let's get out of here.
Hello, this is Ellie Masters. We are coming to the end of Rescuing Melissa. There are 7 chapters that are left, and I can't wait to get to the end with you.
We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Rescuing Melissa, the Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1. Written by Ellie Masters. Narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.